Story 1. The zombie apocalypse had taken over the world. The streets were deserted, and the cities were overrun with the undead. The few remaining survivors huddled together, trying to find a way to stay alive. Among the survivors was a group of teenagers. They had been friends before the apocalypse, and they stuck together to try and survive. They scavenged for food and supplies, and they fought off the zombies that came their way. One day, they stumbled upon an old abandoned laboratory. It was hidden away in the woods, and it was unlike anything they had ever seen before. As they explored the laboratory, they found something that made their blood run cold. It was a serum, labeled "Cure for the Zombie Virus." The teenagers couldn't believe it. They had heard rumors about a cure, but they never thought they would actually find it. They took the serum and quickly made their way back to their safe house. They were ecstatic. They could finally end the apocalypse and start rebuilding their world. But when they tried to use the serum, something went horribly wrong. The serum didn't cure the zombies. Instead, it turned them into something even more terrifying. The zombies began to mutate, growing larger and stronger. Their eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and their teeth became razor sharp. They were no longer mindless creatures, but intelligent beings with a hunger for human flesh. The teenagers were horrified. They had accidentally created something even worse than the zombie virus. They had unleashed a new kind of monster upon the world. They realized that they had to destroy the serum before it fell into the wrong hands. They set out to find the laboratory again, but they were too late. Another group of survivors had found the serum and had already begun using it. The teenagers had to act fast. They fought off the mutated zombies and destroyed the laboratory, hoping to stop the spread of the serum. In the end, they were successful, but at a great cost. They had lost friends and had seen the horrors of the new mutants firsthand. They realized that the world they had known was gone forever, replaced by a new kind of terror. They vowed to continue fighting and surviving, no matter what new horrors awaited them in the future. Story 2. The streets were silent. Not even the sound of a car could be heard. The buildings were empty, and the windows were broken. The sky was cloudy and dark, almost as if it were morning. It was as if the world had come to an end. And it had. It all started with a virus. A virus that had been engineered to cure cancer. But as with all things, there were unforeseen consequences. The virus mutated, and it turned people into zombies. At first, it was just a few isolated cases. But then, it spread like wildfire. Within days, the entire city was overrun. People tried to fight back. They formed militias and barricaded themselves inside buildings. But it was all in vain. The zombies were too strong, too fast, too relentless. And they were multiplying at an alarming rate. And then, out of nowhere, came a man. A man who claimed to have the cure. He called himself Dr. X. He said he had developed an antidote that could reverse the effects of the virus. He offered to share his cure with the survivors, but there was a catch. The catch was that Dr. X needed a human subject to test his cure on. He needed someone who was infected with the virus, someone who was about to turn into a zombie. And he needed them alive. He needed to test his cure before the virus completely took over the subject's body. At first, the survivors were hesitant. They didn't trust Dr. X, they didn't know who he was or where he came from. But as the days went by, their numbers dwindled. They were running out of food, water, and ammunition. They were desperate. And so, they turned to Dr. X. The subject he chose was a young woman named Sarah. She had been bitten by a zombie, and she was slowly turning into one. But she was still alive, still human. Dr. X injected her with his cure, and for a moment, nothing happened. And then, suddenly, Sarah convulsed, and she died. The survivors were devastated. They had put all their hope into Dr. X, and he had failed them. They had nothing left to lose. They decided to fight back, to take on the zombies, to die with honor. And then, out of nowhere, came Sarah. She stood before them, alive, human, and completely cured. Dr. X had succeeded. He had found the cure. But he had also discovered something else. Something that would change everything. The virus was not a virus at all. It was a weapon. A weapon designed to create an army of zombies. And Dr. X was the mastermind behind it all. He had created the virus, released it into the world, and then posed as a savior, offering a cure that only he had. The survivors were outraged. They had been played, used, and manipulated. They had been pawns in Dr. X's game. But they were also relieved. They had a cure. They had a chance to rebuild their world, to start anew. And so, they took Dr. X captive. They put him on trial, and he was found guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison, but it didn't matter. The world had changed forever. The zombie apocalypse was over, and a new era had begun. Story 3. As the sun rose over the city, the first screams pierced the morning air. No one knew where it started, but everyone knew what it was. The dead were rising, hungry for flesh. At first, the living tried to fight back. They barricaded themselves inside their homes, armed themselves with whatever weapons they could find. But it was no use. The zombies were too many, too relentless. As the days turned into weeks, the city descended into chaos. The streets were littered with bodies, both living and dead. The air was thick with the stench of decay. But as the survivors struggled to stay alive, they began to notice something strange. The zombies weren't just mindless monsters. They seemed to be evolving, becoming more intelligent with each passing day. And then, one day, they spoke. At first, it was just a few words, muttered under their breath. But soon, they were speaking in full sentences, forming complex thoughts and ideas. And they had a message for the living. They wanted to coexist. At first, the living were skeptical. How could they possibly live with the very creatures that had caused their world to fall apart? But as they listened to the zombies, they began to see a glimmer of hope. The zombies explained that they didn't want to hurt anyone. They were just looking for a place in the world, a way to survive in a world that had turned against them. And they had a proposal. They would live in a designated area of the city, kept separate from the living by a wall. In return, they would help the living rebuild their shattered world, using their strength and abilities to clear away debris, rebuild structures, and even provide protection. At first, the living were skeptical. But as the weeks turned into months, they began to see that the zombies were true to their word. They worked tirelessly to rebuild the city, never once attacking or harming any of the living. And then, just when it seemed like everything was going to work out, the living discovered the terrible truth. The zombies weren't just evolving. They were mutating. The virus that had created them was still active, still changing them in ways that even they couldn't predict. And as they mutated, they became more and more dangerous, more and more unpredictable. The living had a terrible choice to make. They could keep their bargain with the zombies, trusting that they would remain peaceful, even as they continued to mutate. Or they could break the agreement, and try to destroy the very creatures that had offered them a chance at redemption. But as they made their decision, they knew that the greatest threat wasn't the zombies or the virus. It was the darkness within themselves, the fear and hatred that threatened to tear them apart, even as they tried to rebuild their shattered world.